And we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Intimate Relationships live Q&A. I see we've got a few people already. Emma, you good? You look puzzled.
Yeah. Don't worry. I just had this live open on another tab as a viewer.
Oh my God. Well, hey, at least it didn't get in the way of you showing up here. Hi, I see we've already got a number of folks joining us. Feel free to say hello in the chat if you want to say like where you're coming from or you can always put questions in the chat over the period of the live as well. I'm Ellie Anderson, the host of one of the co-hosts of this live, and newly associate professor of philosophy at Pomona College. Obviously, the person who did the intimate relationships video lecture course, which is presumably why you're here. I am delighted to introduce my co-host, Emma Parkinson. Emma, do you want to tell say a little bit about yourself and how you ended up as my co-host for this live, which I am absolutely honored to be, hosting with you.
Yes. So, hi, my name's Emma. I am a filmmaker. I'm based in London. I've been following Ellie's work for I guess quite a while now. I think first through the Overthink podcast, and I think actually first through your guys' podcast on heteronormativity and heteropessimism back in the day. So when I found out about the course, I was really interested in it. I think a lot of my work looks at romantic relationships and the difficulties in romantic relationships. And I'm developing a rom-com at the moment. So I thought it would be quite an interesting exercise to kind of see all the sources that Ellie was bringing in. And I found the lectures really, really helpful. I'm sure lots of people here have as well. Also, as someone who didn't go to university, I found that attending these lectures has been a really great way of accessing all this material for a very reasonable cost as well.
Thanks so much, Emma. That's really sweet for you to say. And I think when we connected, it was just so clear that you had so many incredible ideas about this course content. And so I was thinking why not cap off the course with a live where we talk about these kind of questions together, and you share questions you have as a subscriber to the course, but then also as somebody who works in this space, doing really interesting work in thinking about romantic relationships today in the context of film. And so I know some of you had a chance to watch Emma's short film Dishes, Dishes, Dishes before the live. If you haven't, that's totally fine. It's freely available on Vimeo. It's under 6 minutes, so it's a quick and very delightful watch. What we're going to be doing over the course of the live today is that Emma and I will first be talking about some of the themes up in particular in a couple of the recent last course lectures. It's totally fine if you aren't caught up on those. That's not a prerequisite of joining the live. Throughout the time that Emma and I are talking, you can all absolutely share questions in the chat as well. And I will address those after my portion of the conversation with Emma is over. But after we sort of share some thoughts and questions around some topics that have come up in recent lectures, we'll talk a little bit about Emma's film Dishes, Dishes, Dishes. And I want to pick your brain about what it's like to filmically represent love, especially in the modern world. And then if you have any additional questions as a course subscriber, feel free to ask those as well. Great. And I see also we have a question for Emma already. So
yeah, I know.
We will get into that. We'll definitely have time for that as well. All right. So first, Emma, the last couple of weeks of course material were this mini unit on the risks of love. And the reason that I wanted to end the course with that is that I feel like towards the end of the course, especially when I teach it at the college level to my students at Pomona, I've been teaching, versions of this course over a decade now. I first taught it in 2017 at 3 different schools total, and the landscape of modern dating has changed a lot. My students are always wondering sort of what do I do with all this material that I've learned, especially because a lot of the course material pertains to the damaging narratives that we have around romantic love and the denigration of friendship and the sort of treatment of romantic love as the be all end all of human life, paired with the complete lack of blueprints for what a healthy relationship actually looks like. So they're like, now what do I do? And part of me is like, well, I'm a philosophy professor. I'm not a therapist. I'm not like in the space of really being able to help. I'm not in the space of being able to dispense straightforward advice in my capacity as a professional. Like I can dispense advice in other capacities, but my role as a philosophy professor is first and foremost to introduce people to what I take to be interesting, important, and influential ideas in the history of philosophy on these topics, whether or not you agree with them. But I also think it's totally reasonable that people are wondering what the takeaway is. And so I think the two readings for that latter part of the course, Alain Badiou's In Praise of Love, this like short, delightful book, and then chapter 6 of Luke Brunning's recent book, Romantic Agency, both get at a version of this question in different ways. This what do I do question. But I think the what do I do question for me, as I've been teaching the course this past year, both at Pomona last semester and then now over the course of this Substack, over a number of months here on Substack, that question has taken a bit of a new form because one of the things I was hearing about a lot from my students is that they're not really living through a time of extensive hookup culture at the moment. We're living through a time of situationships. And that means that commitment phobia has taken on a very different form from when I was my students' age. And in particular, some of the students have talked about how they feel like the commitment phobia isn't about repeatedly hooking up with somebody. That was kind of the commitment phobia when I was in college. It was like one and done, and then like you'll never hear from that person again. Now, I think people are really craving some kind of consistency and stability, but they want that to happen without any strings attached. And that's where we get the rise of the situationship. And Emma, you and I were talking about this a while ago, and I mentioned to you that somebody very close to me had told me that she's in a situationship with a guy who never has taken her out anywhere at all. Like he's only come over to her house. And she was like, "Can't we like go out for a drink or something?" And he was like, I'm only going to date somebody that I plan to marry." And I was just like, you don't understand what dating is. Like, even if marriage is your goal, dating is a way to get there. It's not something that you get once you know that you want to marry somebody. So I just found that to be such a bizarre and nonsensical statement, but one that nonetheless encapsulates some of what I'm seeing in the landscape today. And so I know you have thoughts on this. I'd love to hear wherever you want to
Yeah.
start, whether with like the risk stuff, situationships. Yeah. And then we can take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually so interesting because I think when we were first talking about this, I was like, God, this guy sounds like he sucks. I feel so bad for this person that you know. And then I kind of like took a step back and I was like, hang on a second. I feel like actually, like, I'm so prone to a situationship. I've been on sort of like both sides of the kind of enforcement of the situationship. Um, I feel like that it's so interesting that he's kind of um relegating the simple act of like going out to dinner as holding so much meaning and weight, though. I feel like that is a kind of particular strand of situationship that is like very, very, very controlled. And I guess
If you hear me typing,
yeah.
I might need some notes here and
Mhm.
there.
Yeah. I mean, like when I think about situationships, like there are kind of like I think there is like a more optimistic type of situationship, and I think that there is a really, really harmful type of situationship. The latter is one where there's one person in the party who is like very sure that they don't really want to expand the relationship with the other person, while the other person is like very sure that they do want to expand that relationship, and you're kind of stuck in this situation where person B won't leave for some reason. Normally, I think due to perhaps there's this narrative that like patience will earn them the place of like a real relationship. And whereas person A is withholding, they feel very safe within that withholding and they don't feel like they're ever going to like give in. Um, Whereas I feel like a more kind of the situationships that I tend to find myself more often nowadays are ones where both people kind of recognize that there is a limit to how much they will be able to commit to each other. And I suppose it is something more like a casual relationship, but casual relationships really, like you say, they've changed so much over time. And and like our understanding of them back in the day was maybe that you'd have like a friends with benefits, which I kind of feel like this kind of situationship is. But it's still something that's being developed, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that distinction that you're making is really interesting because I found myself sometimes thinking that situationships are just like this horrible expression of extreme commitment phobia in the present day. And then on the other hand, being like, well, actually, maybe they're a new kind of exciting and potentially even liberatory form of relationship because they're resisting a normativity and some of the other things that we talk about in the course as being potentially problematic. But I think that in order for that to work, and it might be that like it's sometimes one or the other or both, or it doesn't have to be just an either or. But I think that what concerns me a little bit is the frequent denial that a situationship is a relationship. And so I think what that speaks to, because I hear this a lot from, especially from my students, they're like, yeah, a situationship is a way of avoiding being in a relationship. And I think technically what they mean by that is that it's a way of avoiding being in a romantic relationship with all of the expectations that that brings. And I think that's totally fine. Like, I'm not here to say you should seek to, take the relationship escalator from situationship or hookup up to romantic relationship, which is probably exclusive, and then ultimately to marriage and kids. Like, I think those of you who are subscribed to this course know that that's not like a for me, a norm that I think we should necessarily try to live up to. But at the same time, if the claim is actually the situationship is not a relationship because there is no regard for the other person as a source of moral value, as a locus of moral agency, and as somebody who demands respect and to whom you owe just like a basic sense of, yeah, maybe just respect, like, uh, and awareness of their dignity, recognition of their dignity, then we're in a different situation. And it seems to me that a friends with benefits, yeah, friends with benefits kind of situationship where both people are like, this is what I have the bandwidth for right now. I enjoy being with you and I can't offer more, can be mutually affirming, really agreeable, can coexist with all kinds of life affirming activities. And I myself have been in very happy friends with benefits situations in the past. I've also found myself in that other more asymmetrical situation where somebody really wants more and what they basically want is a relationship and the other person is holding back. And I think you described that holding pattern really, really well. I think that holding pattern is often, although certainly not always gendered. You mentioned you've been on both sides of it as well. But I think when that happens, person B, who's the person who wants more, is you mentioned kind of waiting patiently. And I think maybe we might even say cruelly optimistic, to use like the queer theorist Lauren Berlant's phrase, cruel optimism, where they're like, this might change. It's like, you have no reason to believe that it will change and maybe it shouldn't change. And last thing on this too is I'm thinking about a meme that one of you shared in the subscriber chat, which you had also sent to me, which
Yeah.
from a lecture. I've since seen that it was a lecture slide at Harvard, but I don't know whether that's right or not. And it's like a meme of Cynthia Erivo, and it says, does a situationship violate Kant's categorical imperative? And I think the answer to that is yes. So one of the formulations of Kant's categorical imperative, I know we didn't read him in this course, so no Kant background is presumed, but one of the three formulations of Kant's categorical imperative as it's classically understood is that you should treat a person as an end in themselves and not as a means to an end. And I think a lot of times situationships, especially of that asymmetrical sort, just involve using people. And they might involve using people on both sides. The person who wants less might be using the person who wants more for sexual gratification, company, etc., without any of the attendant moral responsibilities. But the person who wants more might also be using the person who wants less as, say, a form of kind of daydreaming about a future that could never be. Maybe there's even like a masochistic element involved. I've definitely found myself in versions of that, luckily long in the past, but at least as of now. But I think that there can be a kind of using on both sides, because if somebody is really holding out hope that a situationship is going to transform into something that it's just like straight up not, and the other person has indicated that there's no chance of it changing to, I think it's also hard to understand the person who continually wants and expects more as really recognizing the other person as an end in themselves either. Like they're in denial about the situation. And I say this with a lot of compassion. I'm not saying like, yeah, that you are bad if you find yourself in this situation, but I think there can be a kind of hypocrisy or denial happening there.
Yeah, because I think at the end of the day, the reason why you stay with someone who is kind of constantly like on the edge or like is constantly withholding is because there's something quite compelling about it. And if you are kind of following the logic of, I don't know, a rom-com or like any romantic drama, like the pursuing and the pursuing and the pursuing is the exciting part, and that's where the fantasy lives, right? Whereas as soon as that fantasy is fulfilled, what then? And I guess the question nowadays is, what does a romantic relationship look like when it is fully realized to a lot of people, particularly to people who, I think there are more and more people nowadays who have not been in a romantic relationship before. There's much more Gen Z people are not dating as much, or they are kind of experiencing more of these situationships where they don't experience what it's like to be in a committed, whether it's a committed monogamous or a committed non-monogamous relationship. They don't know
Yeah.
what that thing is. And also, I guess the other thing that I was thinking about that I think I mentioned to you before was that being in a situationship, it has no bearing on like your personal timeline. Like it's very possible to just like imagine your future still, and you don't have to kind of incorporate somebody else into that future.
Mm.
And I wonder, there's part of me that's like, is there a sort of slightly more existential angle where like in avoiding the concept of like a timeline with someone else, you can just sort of avoid time altogether for a bit?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot because I think there's a toxic form of like romantic relationship futurism, we might say, that is the relationship escalator form, which is that, it's the form that the guy that my friend was dating was, or was resolutely not
Not
dating, but
dating.
was in a situationship with,
Yeah.
was operating on the basis of, which was the idea that you go from dating to marriage. In his mind, I guess by the time you start dating somebody that you're going to end up marrying them. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know what world that poor man is living in,
Yeah.
but it's likely not this one. At least, I mean, this is like LA we're talking about here. So maybe there are some places where that would obviously be the case, but it's not here. So I think there's that form where the idea is that you should always be kind of dating to marry. And that's not to say that that's a terrible idea for everyone if that's like well and truly your goal. But I think very oftentimes people adopt that sort of future oriented idea of romantic relationships without actually really considering whether that is what they want or not. And by that metric, any relationship that doesn't end in forever is a failure. And I think that's really sad because there are so many short-term romantic relationships that like are extremely life affirming and really enjoyable, that yeah, like we can take at face value for what they are. Um but I also think there's a way that even if you're embracing the potential temporary nature of a relationship of whatever form it might take, you might be you might be getting into a situation where you're, yeah, in a holding pattern, to use a phrase that we used before, where it becomes a way of actually failing to recognize whether you want forever because you're punting that question at all, or you're punting that question altogether, right? And so you can just let a situationship last for a year or two and then find, or 5 years or 7 years, and then find yourself being like, is this actually how I wanted to be spending all this time? So I think it really boils down to whether or not you're being honest with yourself and critically reflective about how you're spending your time, what you're spending it on.
Yeah. I mean, well, also there's part of me that when I hear that I only want to date someone that I want to marry, I'm like, is that a little bit of an avoidance of the question of like, I just don't feel enough
Yeah.
here, like I because I think that I don't know, this is gonna sound like very kind of like elementary, but like when you really, really like someone, then I think the question of commitment, like, or the question of time even, like, becomes like much less of a question, I suppose. Or at least like when you're sort of wrapped up in like early limerence,
Yeah.
perhaps. Like it doesn't like the question of forever is like completely unphases you.
Yeah.
Um yeah. I mean, but yes. I don't know. Yeah, I feel like maybe time. But yeah, I mean, like the worst thing that can happen is that you are in a situationship for 4 or 5 years, and then you turn around and you go like, "Wow, well, that time just left. That time
Yeah.
went." And I wonder how many people in there kind of like I kind of wonder what like the age proportion of people in situationships is.
Yeah.
I think it's
I
more
wonder.
people in their 30s.
Yeah, yeah, because I definitely hear about it from my college age students, but I think that
Yeah.
it is, like, more than from, my friends who are in their 30s, but I think, like, it is becoming more and more common, at least is my suspicion. I don't have data on that. I'd be really curious about the data on that. But speaking of data, you mentioned young people, getting into fewer and fewer relationships lately, and that is undoubtedly true. In fact, I was looking up some data for a conference presentation I gave a few weeks ago on Quil Kukla's book, Sex Beyond Yes. And I was just struck by how much has changed in recent years. And it's led me to really want to consider how to understand the changing landscape of romantic relationships, starting with the basic insight that a lot of young people are not finding themselves in relationships. And so what I found is that the sex recession, among Gen Z is absolutely a real thing. This is not just like something that people are unjustifiably worried about. And I think actually I might post, I have like in a couple of weeks, I have an open week where I haven't decided what I want to post yet, but I might actually post my response from that conference, because there was just like a lot of interesting things that I learned that I would maybe want to share. Um, but just as a couple of examples, um, a quarter of young adults in 2024 said that they had no sex within the past year. And a quarter of young adults between on the lower end of that range, between 18 to 24, said that they'd never had sex at all. And when you break it down by gender, 1/5 of women 18 to 24 said that they had never had sex, but 1/3 of men hadn't. And obviously, sex isn't
Wow.
totally tracking like romantic relationships or situationships, but that is a pretty good indication that young people are having a really different kind of relationship, not only to sex, but also to relationships. And I've been thinking about that because I feel like I still teach the course to my students in a way that I assume that like most of them have had sex and maybe are dealing with like trying to figure out what they want from a romantic relationship. And I really can't assume that.
Yeah, that is I mean, it's shocking and not shocking, I suppose. But I I do wonder if it's also because there is a lot more kind of anti-relationship language out there that's being put towards young people nowadays where I mean, even if you're like scrolling on TikTok, right, you've got loads of like all the relationship advice that you got are being given. at like the slightly more like negative end of the spectrum, you're being told that everyone's a narcissist, and also that you've got to protect your peace and you have to practice the art of detachment. All of this kind of, there's all
Yeah.
this going on. And then there's, even on the lighter end of the spectrum, you've got people like knowing what their attachment styles are now. And I think way too much weight is given to attachment theory. Um, and it's kind of, it's kind of, oh, I don't know. It's,
My sister's a therapist and she
yeah,
agrees with that. She's like, look, attachment theory is all well and good, but it's also a theory. And
it's a
the
theory.
idea that it's taken as like biblical truth among young people today is very strange.
And it's very fixed as well. Like you're either one or the other, or maybe
Mm.
you're like the mix, which is the worst one.
Yeah, and look, everybody
Yeah.
thinks they're the mix, but statistically speaking, it's only 4% of the population or something like that who's actually mixed, according to experts.
Yeah, exactly. But there's, I suppose, there's just a lot less room for play and playfulness, which I suppose is something that Brunning stipulates is like quite an important aspect of being able to date in the first place.
Yeah.
And if I think about the way in which, I don't know, if I think about the way in which like my relationships have formed, normal, or like people who I've felt most connected to romantically, it's normally within a space where like we getting to know each other in a kind of friend way over a very long time, where you get that kind of like platonic playfulness in first, you establish some trust,
Yeah.
which then leads into the romantic. And like speaking of running, I'm also thinking about integrity. And it's quite hard to establish who, like, what your integral self is in a dating environment if you just don't have any practice of doing it.
Yeah.
So I wonder if like, because it's becoming so hard for people to even get off the starting marks, where that will lead in what, 5-10 years time.
Hmm. Totally.
Mm.
Totally. Yeah, and I mean, I'm wondering too about because I was thinking about that in relation to sexual practice. That's why I was pulling up those statistics when I was writing about
Mm.
because their book is about basically how good sexual practices require a lot of negotiation and practice. And I was like, I mean, I agree with you, but where are these young people getting their practice today? And so, yeah, I feel like that leads me to think a little bit about Badiou's concerns about the risk-free kind of approach to love. I'm literally the instructor of this course. I should remember exactly what he says about it. I've also read In Praise of Love so many times, but he calls it like the risk averse or the risk-free. Let me pull up my
Oh, yeah. I've literally got it in front of me. You've got like
I,
such a nice cover of your book, by the way. I've got like the kind of like, I don't know what,
yes,
the 90s.
there are two covers to this book. One is cute, one is not. I'm sorry you somehow not cute one. Yeah, it's like the first chapter where he's talking about the Medic app. And
Yeah.
he's talking about like this kind of risk averse or risk. If anybody in the chat also remembers it too, feel free to
Looking through now.
mention it as I like pull up my notes. Because I
Zero
think that
love?
yeah, maybe it's zero risk here. I have my notes too. Let's see. Safety first concept of love.
Yeah.
Yes, which one way of like avoiding the risk or treating love as a futile risk.
Mm.
And so I think, yeah, this idea that you should be protecting your peace. So I actually feel like everything you said falls under the safety first concept of love. And we see that today. I mean, he has like this delightfully kind of outdated example of the French Medic app, but we see that today in so many of the advertisements for dating, both on apps, but also off the apps too. It's like I've
Yeah.
heard about, personal matchmaker services that say we'll give you the kind of security you can't get on the apps because people have realized, and this is very different from when Badiou was writing, just like, within the past couple of decades, that the apps don't give that security. They don't give you a safety first experience of love, even though they promote a safety first concept of love. So then you see the safety first concept moving to other kinds of advertisements that are about things that are the
Yeah.
antithesis.
To matchmaking. But I feel like, I mean, we mentioned materialist before we came on, like, which in itself, like, is this proves immediately that concept doesn't work. It's really, really difficult to vet people. for other people, and like
Mhm.
and also part of that practice is, kind of trains you to suss out people who are maybe more harmful and less harmful. But actually, I don't
Yeah.
actually that concept comes with some slightly negative um, implications about people who end up in abusive relationships, which I don't
Ah,
agree with. But
yeah.
I feel like,
There's risk and then there's risk. We can say that,
yeah,
right?
exactly, exactly. I also wonder with sex, like millennial sex and Gen Z sex, very different experiences. I think I would say, as and not to get too personal here, but as someone who is Gen Z who has sort of experienced like both, I
Mhm.
would say that like I guess conversations about consent and what that means and what communication means within sex and like how risk averse you should be within that environment has changed quite a lot. And
Do you
I
feel
want
Gen Z or millennials are more risk averse in those sexual situations that you're describing?
Gen Z for
Yeah.
sure. I
Okay.
would say I think that every now and then I'll meet like a particularly kind of I'll meet like a millennial man who's sort of like gone above and beyond to sort of like self educate on these things and is like really like, but not a lot of the time there is a lot of like negotiation as opposed to as when it comes to like what you like to be said, what you don't like to be said, what you like to be
Yeah.
asked and not asked. Um, and it's interesting because like I guess Gen Z, there is a very specific moral value attributed to how competent you are in that way.
Mhm.
But I feel like that competence is what competence means in this landscape is so different depending on how old you are.
Yeah, interesting. And I also wonder how that tracks with data on how Gen Z tends to be like much more kink forward. Because I think there would be like I also hear a lot from my students that there's a lot more that BDSM is much more normalized among Gen Z than it is among millennials. And so that would make me think that like maybe there is more of a risk openness among Gen Z because they tend to skew less vanilla. They're also way more of a queer population than millennials. And so I think like more exploratory, whether it's in a kink context or not.
But I'd be interested to know like what the cause of that is. Like why are we more BDSM orientated? Is that because of a is that because of like genuine uh sexual openness and understanding, or is that to some degree because of what we're watching and consuming?
I mean,
Um
for sure, one
yeah,
does have to do with it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's I want to talk a little bit about dishes, dishes, dishes. Before we do that, we've had some really nice comments in the chat. So feel free, those of you who are tuning in, to post comments or questions throughout the live again, whether it's specifically for me or for this portion of the conversation with Emma. So Sarah, thanks for mentioning you had a situationship recently and it was short-lived. Like, and as Sarah also mentioned, someone will always catch feelings while being in a friends with benefits situation. And thanks for suggesting that because I think that gives us like a nice opportunity to think about that momentarily. So I might love for us to just like respond to that before we talk about
Yeah.
the film because this is something I've wondered about a lot. Like, is it the case that someone will always catch feelings while being friends with benefits? And I think my answer to that is I actually don't think that's the case, but I think it depends on the situation and the situation ship. And my most successful friends with benefits experience ever was somebody that I tried being in a romantic relationship with. We both quickly realized that it wasn't going to work out romantically. And then we remained friends. And then we had like a really wonderful friends with benefits situation for some time after that. And I feel like what was special about that experience was that there was just we'd already tried it and it wasn't a thing. And so then we could continue. We had a really wonderful friendship. We also had like a cool sexual component to our relationship together. And there was just like, never again was the question of whether we wanted to like be more than that raised. But I think so in that sense, we didn't catch feelings in the usual sense of the word, but we really care about each other a lot. Like we're still friends to this day.
Yeah, I would say I've had a similar experience there, and actually that ended with us being like, God, I just love you so much as a friend. I just don't understand why we're still sleeping together. So I don't think that it always ends up that way. But I guess like, unless you've explored whether or not a romantic relationship is possible, like you don't necessarily know. It is easy for someone to like at least start asking that question of like, oh, could there be something more here?
Totally,
Um,
totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
And Colton mentions limerence finds a way, which I think could either be construed as a version of someone will always catch feelings, or it could be construed as like if you are in a situation where somebody is prone to be limerent, it's going to emerge. So I think there's,
Yeah.
ways of that.
Yes. Yeah. Agree.
Um, well, tell us a little bit about. So, I invited you to share one of your short films with us because you're sort of wearing two hats in today's live. You're both, as a course subscriber, someone that I'm speaking with, as yeah, like answering. I was going to say I haven't even really been answering your questions. We've just been kind of talking, but it's like a nice opportunity for you as a course subscriber to share thoughts and questions, and as we invite others to do the same here in the chat, but then also in your capacity as a filmmaker who works on these topics. And so I
Mm.
asked you, is a film of yours that you wanted that you want to share with folks in advance, and you suggested Dishes, 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 which I had actually already seen a while back because you had shared that with me last year, but then had a chance to rewatch. And dang. So I just want to share like an initial impression, and then have you tell us a little bit about it. We have a question from Nikki as well in the chat. And if anybody else has questions, feel free to drop them. So Dishes, 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 this 5 minute and 44 second, I think, film.
Wow.
Uh,
Well remembered.
I just rewatched it. I said, um, revolves around a situation in which two people have just moved in together, a man and a woman, and in their experience of newly cohabitating, the man realizes that the woman never does dishes and is actually really terrible, even when asked to do dishes. And then it becomes a sort of uh, obsession for him. He's constantly ruminating and imagining the dishes that haven't been done. He's resenting that he has to do the dishes. And one of my favorite details is the scrub daddy sponge that you have, the big smiley face sponge. And it's almost like taunting them as, this like happy yellow smiley face in this situation of, less than satisfying, not marital quite, but like cohabitating bliss. And I think I probably have more thoughts, but tell me if you feel that's a, fair
Yeah, I
pressing.
think that's a very accurate description. I mean, I feel like it's interesting because, like, as much as I think about relationship narratives so much, but actually, and I'm working on so many projects at the moment where, like, that narrative is like front and center. But actually, in terms of the work I've made so far, I think Dishes, Dishes, Dishes is probably um, the most realized film there. Weirdly, um, so I mean, I'll address Nikki's question as to begin with, which was about obviously the woman is the one who's not very good at doing the dishes, and the man is the one who's like concerned about it. And Nikki said, given the fact that women have to assume the lion's share of domestic labor in relationships with men because of really harmful and unfair gender social scripts, I was wondering whether this was an intentional choice. And yes, it was, because I think so. The relationship that we were depicting, like the guy involved, he's a good modern man. He considers to himself to be like a good guy. And I felt like if I played it out the other way round, then it reads more like a horror story rather than an exploration of these invisible wedges within relationships. I think the fact that there is an expected uh, asymmetrical share of housework feeds into him not talking about it or not addressing it explicitly and openly. Um, and the question becomes like, how does he navigate this situation with her where he doesn't feel like he can be wholly honest with her, and how does that impact the rest of their relationship? Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's a great lead up to a question I wanted to ask too. And I think that's, yeah, a really interesting answer to Nikki's question. Because when I'm watching the film, I'm wondering, why doesn't he say something? And
Yeah.
so I think there are a lot of reasons that that might be, of course, and I'm sure you have many thoughts on why that might be. I had a moment of being like, is it a little British that he's not saying something? But I also think in relation to some of what came up in the intimate relationships course material around like men's relatively low levels of disclosure, some of the stuff that I've worked on in hermeneutic labor, with thinking about how men tend not to raise relationship issues. I think obviously that was something that I think about when I think when it's like a man in the situation, and so yeah, thoughts on why he wouldn't mention, because he doesn't mention it as an issue at all. There's one time where he says, "Could you wash up?" right when they're like about to hook up, and she does, but he doesn't ever confront her and say, "Can we, negotiate on this point? Can we evenly share the labor of dishes?"
Yeah. And a conflict avoidance, something that
Yeah.
Brits are really great at, right? Um, and to some degree, a little bit of risk aversion, because in naming the problem, he would have to name a difference between them. And
Mm.
I I do think maybe this is more British relationships, but I do think that for the most part, it people want to assume that there's like a natural level of compatibility between them, right? And like they don't want to, and every sort of like incompatibility you name is a bit of a threat to the relationship.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
I I think that he doesn't want to impact the kind of the image of the relationship that they've created together. I also I also think that, and like it is a ridiculous version of this because like yes, he should just talk about it. But I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
that
it's a filmic
yeah.
representation, of course.
Um but I think that this kind of masking is so common. And I'm thinking about like another very literal film example of Everyone Rides the Carousel, which is an animation that had Meryl Streep and Jack Nicholson in it, where you have like two lovers talking to each other and they're talking about the future and like all the things that they're going to do together. And then as they're talking, they kind of both grow masks on the outside and the shadows of their faces grow inside as they start to like have these doubts, but continue talking to each other like everything is fine.
Everyone rides
Um,
the carousel, you said?
yeah, Everyone Rides the Carousel.
Fantastic name.
It's great. It's 70s, but I still think it's very relevant. Um, which is to say, I
Be modern from a philosophy of relationships perspective. So
well, yeah, but I think this sort of relates a bit to maybe what you and Yuhang were talking about when you were talking about what is expected to be shared within romantic relationships.
Mhm.
There is this implicit understanding that you are going to share with each other all the time, but I think the reality is miles away from that.
Yeah.
Um,
I actually don't think that's necessarily always a good thing. Like, I grew up in a family where it was considered healthy to literally talk about every potential grievance or annoyance you had, and like, in my cohabitating partnership now, that is not the case, and I actually really find that to be, like, so much more manageable and stable, to be able to think to myself, "Okay, there's a threshold of things that like under which yeah, there's a threshold where some things fall under that threshold and it's just not worth like bringing up or causing conflict. But then there are plenty of things that are above that threshold that I will discuss and that, we'll discuss for sure. But I don't need to talk about everything all the time, especially because like
mhm.
a lot of things annoy me. So because I think that part of that is because of my personality. Like obviously there are many layers that we could unpack, but I will like as somebody who has OCD tendencies, like I sometimes have to let things go.
Yeah, yeah. But I wonder, because then there's part of me that, because like I think my feeling about love coming onto the course was like to love someone you have to know them. And I wonder at what point that kind of withholding prevents you from being known by the other
Yes.
person. Um, and I've been thinking about this also with people who are, I don't know, who are a bit more deceptive. Is it possible for a deceptive person to be loved? I mean, I think yes, but yeah, I think I've had to sort of like reevaluate what it means to know somebody
Yeah.
over the course of this. And I think that actually Badoo's um what's it, scene of two
Yeah.
also like provides a slightly more accurate picture of this, where I think maybe to know the best way to know someone is you can only really know how you're different to each other and the ways in which you're not going to know them, painting a slightly more like broad outline and shape of the
Yeah.
person, and that's like where the love is. um
Yeah, I think
yeah.
that's a fascinating question. One of the things that came up as like a really big topic of discussion in my intimate relationships course at Pomona last semester was whether you can be friends with somebody who's a pathological liar. Um, because I mentioned like one of my really good friends is, and when that person has been like the best romantic relationship I've seen that person be in was a relationship with somebody who could call them out and who could
Mm.
really, and so I think mm, like they did really know each other, but my friend's partner knew them well enough to know that this is something that is a part of you, and there's like, and I can accept it and I can also call you out about it. And that it came up especially in class apropos of a couple of the friendship readings about disclosure. Like I think the Thomas, maybe the Cocking and Kennett as well. Yeah, and I've been wondering about that too, because I think on the one hand, the Badoo scene of two really shows like no matter how well you know somebody, you can never know them completely because you can't occupy their position. But I think I used to be all in on that view. I was like, you can never really know someone as they are. And I don't know. In recent years, I'm kind of like, that's not that satisfying though, because I can know people better than others. And I can definitely be in relationships where people know me better than I know myself in some cases,
Mm.
right? But I think too, when it comes to bringing stuff up, I think it would be weird if you're in an intimate relationship where you literally never bring something up that bothers you. But I think there's also a time and a place for bringing things up. So like I think in the case that I was mentioning where I tend to like be kind of easily annoyed, there's nothing that I have never brought up that bothers me, but there are certain instances where I'm like, I don't need to bring that up this time, right? And I kind of like thinking about when
Mm.
to bring it up, and also having a moment of reflection, like, does that actually need to bother me or not? And we'll move on in a sec, but just an example that was coming up for me as I was rewatching Dishes, 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 and in relation to some of the discussion is that I dated this guy one time who was insistent that every time you use the bathroom, the entire toilet lid should be closed. Like you don't put the seat down, you put the whole lid down.
Yeah.
And I was like, but like why? And his answer was that he thought it looked better. Like it's not that it was gross inside or anything. He just like thought it looked better. And
Okay.
I was like, yeah, but is that really necessary? And I think in an ideal world, be able to have a conversation about, okay, does your aesthetic preference outweigh the obvious convenience of not having to close and open the lid every time one goes to the bathroom? But it was like such a, I don't know, just such a kind of like what felt to me like a nitpicky preference. And we never really were able to find common ground on that. Relationship did not end because of that. But it was like
Wow.
continually a little bit of like, and Trey says, I agree with this guy who I
Yes,
recently
no.
met. Trey, we wanna hear
I
your
think I can guess what Trey's reasons are, and I think it's about germs.
okay, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe if the toothbrush is right next to the toilet, I don't know. Yeah. If maybe there is a good reason, but the reason was
And
not
so it's
given.
like it's all about the look of it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like mental. Like, but I but was it really that big of an issue that you just felt like it was an insurmountable problem?
No, it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't the reason the relationship ended, but I felt like the inability to really have uh, a helpful conversation around that, or like I don't know, a kind of even-handed conversation about it spoke to some maybe larger issues in the relationship.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I'm seeing Colton too had asked, can risk aversion keep someone in a relationship they're not sure of? My guess is that your answer to that, Emma, would be yes. My answer is
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even I just think it's so I also think it's just really easy to be in a relationship with someone who's like fine
Yeah.
nowadays. like a lot of a lot of breakups that I'm seeing at the moment, I feel like for one person in the relationship it comes as a massive shock, but for the other person is like, and it's a horrible observation to make, but like it's because they were kind of just sort of killing time
Yeah,
in throughout the relationship, which I think is almost more insidious than a situationship, is to like be with someone you just that you're just kind of like, this is fine, but I just don't. It's like it fulfills XYZ purpose.
totally.
We're committed.
Yeah.
Mm-mm-mm.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think if we lived in a world where we were much more capacious around the kinds of relationships that we accepted, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. Like, I don't think every relationship has to be utterly incredible, but if you're looking for a stable partnership long term and you think you have that, and in fact your partner is killing time, like, that's a really damaging form of deception. I think that's the real problem there, is that it's a form of deception.
Yeah. Yes.
Ugh.
I'm
Um,
aware also that we kind of passed our 45-minute mark.
I know I was like, "Emma, join me the first 45 minutes, then I'll move to other questions." I definitely have time for any and all other questions that emerge. We also got Trey's answer, which is
Yeah.
a small apartment means that your toothbrush and other things are near the toilet, so you don't want the toothbrush falling into an open toilet. Valid, totally valid.
Yeah.
In this case, there was like a half bath that was completely unrelated to like toothbrushes or showers. That was
Wait,
still
what's a half bath?
it's a room with just a toilet and sink in it.
Oh, I see, I see, I see.
Yeah, so, like, no shower, and in this case, there was no, like, toothbrush or anything. It was, like, the entry hallway,
Yeah.
bathrooms. Um, but yeah, no, Emma, I am, like, I'm so grateful for that this course got put us in touch. I mean, I think that's really beautiful. That's also one of the reasons that I wanted to, invite you to this live as well, because I feel like this is a great example of the kinds of discussions that Substack has enabled. As everybody on this live knows, like, I still feel very new to Substack. I'm still trying to kind of figure out what works and what doesn't. And one of the funny things that happened a couple weeks ago, once the intimate relationships videos technically ended, was I was like, shoot, there's so much more to say about this. And so I've decided to do some more content related to the course in the past couple weeks and in the couple of coming weeks before starting the new one, which will be on selfhood and identity, which, don't get me wrong, I'm also very excited about. But I'm thinking too about ways to kind of continue on the intimate relationships discussion. So if you or any others have like further thoughts about this, I absolutely welcome them. But I'm like so grateful for your support and kind words, and so glad that you found the course.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing about love is that it's an ever ongoing situation, isn't it?
Yeah,
So love as
totally.
discourse is a situationship. It's never going to end. It
Yeah.
never really ends. Ah. Um,
Were there any final thoughts or questions that you wanted to raise?
I guess I wondered if anything from teaching the course this time around made you like change any thoughts or ideas that you had about love.
Yeah. I mean, so the answer is definitely yes. And in fact, I have been thinking about there have been some things that have really inspired me towards new ideas that I'm looking forward to developing. And I think one of them is that I've been feeling for some time that romantic relationships just need to be kind of knocked off their pedestal a bit. I think they're important and valuable, but I really buy the amatonormativity critique that suggests that we give them way too we give them way too much of a pride of place in our society, and we need to think about that critically. But one thing that teaching the course this time around, and sharing these, videos here on Substack and having conversation with folks has led to is my sense that in some ways, actually, our friendships need to become more like romantic relationships too.
Mhm.
And so, even though I'm not going to pull a Montaigne and say that you can have only one complete friend, like, I don't think we need to move in the monogamy direction. I've been reflecting on the way that some of the theorists of friendship talk about how important disclosure is and talk about seeing friends in moral contexts, and how I think we voided a lot of the moral content of friendships in our ways of experiencing them today, such that any confrontation is instantly understood as drama. And whereas in romantic relationships, we tend to be able to sustain a very high level of confrontation. In friendships, we tend not to. And so even my question about dishes, 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 like, hey, why didn't this guy bring it up? I think if it were two friends who were rooming together, his not bringing it up would actually make a lot of sense to me, because I think that coheres more with like the norms of friendship. So been thinking about ways that actually are ways of approaching friendships, or approaches to friendships rather, could stand to learn from norms of romantic relationships, especially around disclosure.
Mm. But definitely more open to long-standing resentment in friendships. Yeah.
And not confronting people. I mean, I was thinking about this. I just mentioned my friend. Like, it was like a pathological liar. I have confronted her on a few occasions, but not nearly as many as I would have if we were in a romantic relationship.
Are the lies like, how bad are they?
It kind of runs the gamut. I'm laughing because I don't know what else to do. It runs the gamut. They're mostly minimal though. And I have like a complex theory, because I've been friends with this person for such a long time. I have a complex theory for like why psychologically like the lies happen. Um
Mm.
But I don't necessarily share that. Like, I feel like my friend is not aware of this complex interpretation that I have of her behavior. So maybe like I've been wondering, because we did work through a conflict recently, and actually we worked through the conflict really well. And that was part of what made me think too, like, oh wow, this is actually somebody who can understand that confrontation is not drama. But there are also certain things that feel like beyond something I can confront her about. And
Mm.
it's led me to really wonder, like, should I try and get over that?
Mm. Should you try and get over the fact that she lies?
Should I try and get over my own avoidance of
Oh,
confrontation
yeah.
and
Yes.
actually like confront her about the lies more?
Yes. Yes. And
Yeah.
interestingly, wait, so Sarah has said, I regret confronting my friend with benefits over and over, lol, which is like a fun middle ground. Um, because I guess you
Totally.
do have the intimacy, at least a little bit of the intimacy.
Oh, and
Um,
Samantha, living in queer intentional community, it's so important to make space for compassionately addressing conflict. We have cone of small shit sessions with semi-regular house meetings to clear the air and reaffirm our friendships, housemates. I love cone of small shit session.
I
That
want to
is,
know what that means. Like,
yeah.
you have a phone of small
Yeah,
stuff?
it's probably like I mean, Samantha, tell me if I'm getting this wrong. It's probably like a cone of silence, like where you have a comfortable, safe space to air your grievances, but then it's not taken to, like it's not taken as starting drama. It's sort of like you have the cone where you address it and then it's over after that point. And I also think I'm really glad, Samantha, that you bring up the queer community aspect of this, because I actually think that underlying this sort of like weird way that we demarcate friendships from romantic relationships is heteronormativity. Because I think like sometimes when friends confront each other, it becomes easy, especially when those friendships are same sex friendships, it becomes easy for the friend confronted to be like, ooh, that's kind of creepy. It's almost like you're treating me like a romantic partner. And what's underlying that? Like homophobia. So I also think that there's a lot without as like a straight person being like, queer communities have solved it all. Like I think that there's so much that queer community approaches offer for robustly and completely toxically heteronormative society. And in fact, I'm actually ashamed to say that I haven't read this earlier, but I've just been reading Jane Ward's The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, which basically is a book about how, as a queer lesbian feminist, Jane Ward is in solidarity with straight people because of how shitty heterosexuality is. And the reason I say I'm embarrassed I didn't read it earlier, because I've like published in a journal with Ward, and we work on very similar topics, but I hadn't actually read this book all the way through, and it's a total banger. So
Yeah.
anyway, and I want to be mindful of your time, Emma. So if there's anything quick you want to say before then I kind of take it over and address additional questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you so much for having me. I wanted to quickly address Sarah saying that, yeah, that sounds like a really bad situation. And again, people using people as means to an end rather than an end.
Sarah, I feel like this book is a
Yeah.
nice balm for what
Yeah.
it's worth.
I feel read it. But thank you so much for having me, Ellie. I'm looking forward to joining the rest of the chat now, just for the general
Yeah.
Q&A. This has been so much fun.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Emma. And obviously we'll all remain in touch. We've got the subscriber chat. We can keep this conversation going.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
All right. This has been so nice here with Emma. I absolutely love this conversation. Now, just in this remaining portion of the live, I'm going to address any additional questions that folks might have. I got a couple in advance that I'm happy to discuss, but you can absolutely share additional ones here too. Again, you don't have to be up to date with the course material. I don't want you to feel like that there's any pressure to do that. In fact, like, kind of the whole point of the Substack is that now you have, as a paid subscriber, the archive of materials. And so you will continue having that indefinitely. So let me make sure I haven't missed any initial questions in the chat. I think all of this conversation has pertained to the first portion of the conversation with Emma. So, all right, I want to address a question that I received in advance from Trey so Trey sent 2 questions in advance. So I'll start with those because I actually don't think I got additional ones so far. So please send additional ones if you have them. I can stay on and answer them. But the first question from Trey is, what are your personal mandatory non-monogamy reads? If someone were interested in living the lifestyle, what books or resources would you point towards for a good starter education? I should also clarify, this is the same Trey who mentioned being a lid closer because of the small apartment. So shout out, hi. For personal mandatory non-monogamy reads, a couple of them are ones that I have already assigned in the course because I think that they're essential. And so I would say, from a philosophy perspective, which of course is like my background, I think Harry Chalmers's essay, Is Monogamy Morally Permissible, is just so good for revealing to us the assumptions that we have around relationships, namely monogamous assumptions, and questioning those. And I also think, on the kind of sexual exclusivity side, the Natasha McKeever essay that I assigned is essential. So I would say, like, those are 2 reads that I would suggest to anyone. And luckily, you all have access to those, plus my videos on that, in virtue of being in the course. Another text that I really like is from the philosopher Carrie Jenkins. Her book, What Love Is. Carrie Jenkins has written a couple of books on love, most recently Sad Love. What Love Is, I think, remains a really nice primer to philosophy of love that is open to non-monogamy. And so What Love is not specifically a book about non-monogamy, but it's a book about the philosophy of love that touches on why some philosophers have thought that love was inherently monogamous and why she doesn't think that that works. So I think that book is, super interesting, a great read. In some previous iterations of what now has become the Intimate Relationships course, I've taught that book. So I think it's great. I also love Justin Clardy's work. I assigned part of his book, Why It's Okay Not to Be Monogamous, in the course, of course, but he has a lot of good articles too. And so, I love his work. Actually, Carrie, Justin, and I co-hosted a conference a few years ago at Pomona on philosophy of non-monogamy, which was just a ton of fun. So I really cherish both of them as people and as scholars. Outside of philosophy, the text that I think is probably most helpful, although it's funny because we were kind of talking about how attachment theory tends to be a bit overblown earlier in the live, is Jessica Fern's Polysecure. This is a book that a lot of people have benefited from. It's a book I've benefited from. It's a book that I have recommended to my own partners because I found it so helpful. And so I think if you're looking to open up or consider opening up, Polysecure is really useful because what it does is show that you can have a secure attachment within the space of a monogamous relationship, non-monogamous relationship. And I do think there is like a lot to be said for secure attachment, even if I think like the constant appeal to attachment theory as the solution to, or the explanation rather, of all relationship problems today is a bit misguided. So Jessica Fern's Polysecure is great. All right. And then moving on. So Trey's second question is, what can monogamous people do to avoid falling into toxic monogamy culture? I feel like non-monogamous people work to rid ourselves of these trappings, But many progressive mono people likely want to do the same since so much of monogamous culture is tightly interwoven with heteronormative patriarchal culture. So basically, like for people who are monogamous, how can they avoid falling into the toxic elements of monogamy, the ones that have these cultural elements? So I would say first on this question, I think it's a great question. First, I think that monogamous people can learn about non-monogamy in a good faith and curious way, and what non-monogamy means for non-monogamous people. Because I think a lot of times there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction among monogamous people where they'll basically say, oh, that's like an interesting lifestyle choice for you, but I could never do it. And that's where the conversation around non-monogamy actually ends. I think that's where the conversation around non-monogamy should begin, even for people who are committed to monogamy and want to remain that way. Because a lot of non-monogamous people are non-monogamous not because they want to like have sex with more than one people and just like have a sexual romantic jubilee, but because they have pretty serious concerns with what Trey in the question has described as toxic monogamy culture. So I would say whether that's through discussion or through reading about it, that can be a really useful way to start. And I would say, in addition to some of the books that I recommended, maybe this actually speaks a little bit to the first question too. Kim Tallbear's blog, oh gosh, what is it called? The Critical Polyamorist is a really great series of resources where Tallbear has shared a lot of blog posts on, and written a lot of blog posts about like what are some political reasons for non-monogamy. They tend to come from a indigenous way of thinking, or like most of their kind of previous commitments are coming from indigenous thought. And so I think that is like a super good place to start too, the Critical Polyamorist posts. And then I would say, in addition to learning about non-monogamy and what it means for people, I would also say that monogamous people should start to be critical about the expectations that they have about monogamy and how it shows up in their lives, and just be curious about those. For instance, like, do you find yourself threatened by the mere presence of a non-monogamous person because you think that they're going to try and hook up with your partner, or because you think they'll influence your partner to want to be non-monogamous? And just kind of start reflecting on that. I think that was really crucial in my own journey, was thinking about, okay, when impulses of fear, it's often in terms of these like negative emotions of fear, a sense of insecurity or threat, jealousy, that the messages of monogamy rear their heads. And so I would suggest to monogamous people to be thoughtful about that. And that also leads to the third and final thing I want to say on that, which is that I think monogamous people should explore their reasons for monogamy and be able to defend them, at least to themselves. Like, don't assume that monogamy is just like the way that you need to conduct a relationship, and anybody who doesn't conduct a relationship that way is weird. Like, you should be able to defend why you are monogamous, because it is also a relationship formation. And it shouldn't necessarily, because it's the default, be taken as not requiring any sort of defense. All right. So we've got a question from Kritika here, who has shared that you're joining us from India. Welcome. Quite the time difference we've got there. So glad you could make it. And Kritika's question is, how to effectively get rid of or minimize the pain of limerence, especially when you have an ambitious goal and a hectic schedule? Oh my gosh. I feel for you. If this is coming from a place of first person experience at the moment, I really feel for you. Or even if it's not, like, I feel this question a lot because I have been there. And do I have the answers is a question. I think I can't remember if I mentioned this in the chat or not. I don't think I did. But there's a new book that I actually haven't written yet. Or sorry, well, there are plenty of new books that I haven't written yet. We'll see if I do in the future. But I meant to say there's a new book that I haven't read called Smitten by Tom Bellamy, which is an exploration of limerence, including suggestions for how to overcome it. And it is just now out. I think it was maybe out in the UK before, but it just came out in February here in the US, and may be available Kritika also in India. At least, yeah. And there's like an ebook, etc. Here, I'll just share the link. And what's really interesting about Bellamy, who's the author of it, is that he's actually an expert in the psychology of addiction. And he found himself in a monogamous marriage, extraordinarily limerent towards a colleague. And he ended up disclosing to his wife, hey, I don't know what's going on, but I feel really limerent towards this colleague. And he and his wife then undertook to like do a bunch of research on the science of limerence to help him overcome it. So, like I said, I haven't had a chance to read the book yet myself, but I do think that it is a place I would recommend starting. And although I haven't read the full book yet, he's written a couple of articles about it. I think one of which we discussed in the Overthink episode on limerence. So sorry if you've already listened to that episode and heard me talk about Tom Bellamy, but now the full book is out, so you can check it out. I think in my own experiences, which I kind of wish that I'd had this book the last time I was dealing with this. But I think in my own experience, really trying to reground and reorient my life away from patterns of thinking that revolve around the LO have been crucial. And some of that just has to do with, kind of imaginative reorientation. When I find myself moving to that place of thinking about this person obsessively, trying to maybe replace the thought with something else or move out and do a different activity. So some of these techniques are ones that come from cognitive behavioral therapy. As I mentioned earlier in the live, obviously I'm a philosophy professor, not a mental health professional. So I do recommend like working with somebody on this if it's something that, anyone here is really struggling with. Because I think psychology, some of the forms of therapy, including cognitive behavioral therapy, can really be helpful here. Mindfulness has also been extremely important to me. So I know some of you likely know I'm a longtime meditator in the Theravada Vipassana Buddhist tradition, which is basically, the what now is known as kind of mindfulness meditation. And I have found that very, very helpful because it's mainly way of recognizing your thoughts when you're in the act of them. And unlike CBT, where there's often a kind of thought replacement, mindfulness involves just kind of recognizing the thought for what it is. And then ultimately that helps sort of disentangle you a little bit from it. But I think it's a matter of disentangling or decathecting your identity from thoughts about the LO. And those are a couple of strategies that I found useful for that process. Because I think it's really a matter of philosophically speaking, ontologically regrounding your own existence in something other than your attachment to the limerent object. All right. Other questions? Or even if they're just thoughts, I can stay on a little longer if anyone has more. Is there any other links that I was going to share? Maybe I'll just riff for a second while I see if there are any remaining questions. And then if not, I know this live has already gone on quite a bit, so we can always close after. But one thing that I'm going to see if I have a chance to write about this week, because I would really, really like to, is the new Lindy West memoir, Adult Braces, where West writes about her experience of opening up her marriage and now being in a happy triad that's been going on now for a number of years. There has been so much backlash against this book, and I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. I feel like that's a constant refrain for me. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but honestly, I I'm not ashamed to say that because who has time to read everything at all times? I find the pace of book talk and Instagram and stuff for reading just totally overwhelming. So I'm often a few years behind on reading things. But the Adult Braces text just came out and recently, and I really want to check it out. But I listened to Lindy West's Modern Love podcast describing her journey with non-monogamy. And I found myself just totally delighted, smiling much of the time. I think it's a really beautiful account of the trajectory and journey that she had with it. But there has been so much backlash, and people have been basically saying like she was coerced by her partner into doing it. There's been some like frustrating articles on the internet, including one from Tyler Austin Harper in the Atlantic a couple of days ago, whose work on non-monogamy I have nothing but negative things to say about, because he basically just every time he writes about non-monogamy is like, why would anyone do this? And then has like no curiosity about people's reasons for it. That goes back to my answer to an earlier question. So I've been thinking about maybe writing something on that, and just the way that I think like non-monogamy has started to become cringe over just the past year or two. And in fact, Gen Z has a more favorable view of monogamy than even boomers do, let alone millennials. So I think there's a real backlash against non-monogamy happening right now in Gen Z, partly for some of the reasons that Emma and I were discussing earlier, including the fact that Gen Z doesn't really have like much of a chance to explore relationships at all. So they might be sort of attaching to this relationship formation that they haven't even yet experienced, which is like monogamous romance. Um, but I think the backlash against the Lindy West memoir is just like really a microcosm of some of the backlash against non-monogamy in general that we're seeing right now. Um, all right. Okay. Couple more questions here. So Colton is asking, in a way, does limerence want to continue like desire wants to go on desiring? Yes, I think that is right. If we think about Tenov's definition of limerence, she describes it as involving disequilibrium. And there's a careful balance of, well, it's almost like an equilibrious disequilibrium, where there's a careful balance of hope and uncertainty. And I think that's one way of describing this, like maybe conatus that limerence has. This balance of hope and uncertainty, I think, is the way that we see this impotence for limerence to continue on and on. But as we know, also, Tanov thinks it's ultimately unsustainable. And so even if limerence wants to continue in this disequilibrious fashion, Tanov at least thinks that it cannot uh, be withstood indefinitely, or cannot continue indefinitely. Um, Great. And then we have a couple of questions. So Emma's joined us now in the chat and has a question, perhaps a follow on from that, related to risk aversion. Is heartbreak unnecessarily vilified? Also, yes, I think heartbreak is definitely unnecessarily vilified. We have a kind of a very short window of tolerance for people who are heartbroken, where we say like, oh, I feel so bad for you. And then, the next night your friends are like, let's go out, let's forget about it. And the grieving process, especially when the relationship has been short term, or maybe it was like an unrequited situation, or if the person did something bad for which, your friends think that they should be morally vilified. I think our society does vilify heartbreak, and it leads people to kind of have to hide within themselves the grief that they're experiencing. I also think this definitely is the case for a lot of people in non-monogamous relationships, where if you have, let's say you have a stable nesting partnership, and then you also have a partner, like a girlfriend that you're dating, and you break up with that girlfriend, our society doesn't recognize that heartbreak as something that is worth grieving, or even legible as grievable to begin with. And I think that's often really hard for non-monogamous people, which is why it can be super helpful to have a supportive community of people who actually do understand that as a valid form of heartbreak. Perhaps one exception to heartbreak being vilified would be in long-term spousal situations where somebody is widowed, where we tend to understand that that kind of relationship is likely to take years to get over. But I think we also have really clear ideas of what kind of grief, what that grief should look like. And that also takes us to legibility. And I think in the background of all of this is Freud's essay, Mourning and Melancholia, where Freud talks about mourning as being this sort of process of overcoming your grief that has a fixed endpoint, because you kind of are able to digest the loss and overcome it. And melancholia is where you're not able to digest the loss, and there's this undigested kernel of grief that stays within you and becomes I mean, it's been a while since I've read this essay, so I'm taking some liberties here, but becomes almost like a masochistic form of self-flagellation. And Derrida questions that distinction between mourning and melancholia and says, like, can we really say that there is just like this digested grief and then undigested grief? And the way that mourning is normalized and melancholy is seen as pathological, I think is part of what Derrida wants to question and maybe applicable here to heartbreak. And Emma says that you're thinking about Mariana Alessandri's Dark Moods here, which is a book that I really enjoy. We featured it on Overthink. We had an interview with her where she talks about depression and anger and a lot of kind of, dark moods that are treated with disrespect, or at least with like a lack of care, respect, and attention in our society. All right. I can't tell you how fun it's been to be thinking about this stuff with you all. And I feel like in these lives, I'm still trying to figure out the lives because with the videos and even with my podcasting work, there's like a level of formality that I think turns my brain on in a way that maybe the lives like totally don't or don't completely. And so I don't know. I hope you all have found this as enjoyable as I have, because I feel like I'm a little bit less coherent in the lives than I am in some of my other work. Um, Colton asked a question now about the course on the self. So I think this is actually a great way to close. I can talk a little bit about that. Colton's asking, will the course on self include or focus on phenomenology, reading Heidegger right now? And the answer to that is yes. So I know there's been some interest in a phenomenology course. I know there's been some interest in courses that are kind of more movement based, right? I've also been thinking I'll probably do something on existentialism in the future, and existentialism and phenomenology obviously have a lot of overlap. So I'm trying to think about how to do that. But the first course, obviously, on intimate relationships was topics based. And so that means that I was able to think about a lot of different philosophers from different periods in the history of philosophy and bring them together around the topics of intimate relationships. And that's the case with some of the courses that I teach in my life as a college professor. And then there are some other courses that I teach that are more history. See, I told you I was feeling a little less coherent. History or movement based. So I also teach existentialism. I teach some classes on phenomenology or on like 19th and 20th century continental European philosophy. So I'm thinking about what would be like the most useful way to introduce some of the material on phenomenology, whether it's like in its own course or in a topics based course. But the selfhood and identity course for sure will involve some Latina feminist phenomenology, some existential phenomenology, including for sure Sartre, probably Heidegger, but I need to kind of finalize my thoughts on that. And then also some perspectives from, well, I'm still still working it out. I'm teaching a version of it at Pomona right now and thinking about how to make it most like legible for Substack, but probably some things from analytic philosophy, trans and queer philosophy, maybe Buddhist philosophy. So I'm super excited about it. I just finished my manuscript on the existential phenomenology of selfhood recently. And so this will be, sort of more expansive than that, because that book is like really for specialists, although you are absolutely welcome to check it out once it comes out. It won't be for a while, but that's like really in the weeds. And obviously that's not going to work as well for a Substack course. So thinking about how to make this accessible. I really appreciated Emma's comment earlier that as someone who didn't go to university, you felt you got a taste of the university lecture experience through these videos. And I think, it's so different to be engaging in this form of community than it is to be in a classroom. And at the same time, I want to be able to give some of what I can offer to my students in the classroom. I want to be able to give some of that to a broader public. And I think Substack so far has been a really great way to do that. And when I say it's really different, there's also advantages to this sort of format too, where I'm not like grading your work and we can have a different kind of conversation. So I really encourage you all to keep up with the subscriber chat as well. I know folks are taking this at different paces. And so feel free also to reach out to one another. I think it would be incredible if some of the folks who have subscribed to this course meet up on your own to discuss the course material. I just think that would be like such a cool way to engage further. So I think that is the all the questions I got for now, and really, really appreciate your attending this, whether you're here live or watching this after. Feel free to follow up with questions in the chat or on this post. And yeah, I will well, I'll post on Wednesday. There will be a written post, and then there will be a couple. I'll keep you updated basically about the coming weeks and what the content's going to look like. But there will be something, hopefully, that you all enjoy for subscribers each week indefinitely. So thank you all so much.